Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. I am especially grateful to Rabbi Eliezer Zaklikovsky for having come here on the eve of the Shabbat. Dr. Zaklikovsky serves the Shabbat Jewish Center of Monroe. He is a graduate of the Yeshiva Torah's MS, a rabbinical college situated in Jerusalem, Israel. But most notably, I found that he directed the world's largest Passover Seder in Kathmandu, Nepal, which I found most intriguing. So with great gratitude and on behalf of Muslims for Peace, I invite the Rabbi to come and address us.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't know where you found all those secrets. Jimmy comes home from school and he sees that his father is looking at his report card and he's shaking with his head. On every line there's another failing mark. And he's looking at his son with amazement. So Jimmy looks up at his father and says, "So Dad, tell me, do you think this is hereditary or environmental?" It's an honor to be here and to be part of an organization that promotes peace. It's also a special honor to be asked to be the first to speak out of respect for the Shabbos, which starts in my synagogue at 7 o'clock. So I'll be brief. Our hearts and our minds and our prayers are directed at Ukraine, where we pray for peace, for a quick resolution, and for an end to war and bloodshed and violence. Our organization, the Chabad movement, originates in Ukraine. So I'll share a little story that I think has a lot of meaning. The Hasidic leader that I was part of was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson of blessed memory, who passed away some years ago. But on Tuesday, we're going to pay tribute to his 120th birthday. There was a proclamation signed by our beloved mayor recognizing that day as Education and Sharing Day USA, and it's being done all over the country, starting in Washington and in states and cities and townships around the country. So his predecessor in Ukraine would direct a network of schools and hospitals and orphanages helping the community. So one day he receives a representative from the city of Kharkov, and he asks him in Yiddish, "Was herzach in Kharkov?" What's happening in Kharkov? So he says to the rabbi, "The schools are flourishing, people are praying, people are kind to each other. There's so much good happening." And the rabbi takes out a gold coin and says, "This is for safekeeping, and may God always be with you." Later that day, another person comes in from a different area in Kharkov, and the rabbi asks him again, "What's herzach in Kharkov? What's doing in Kharkov?" So he responds, he says, "People are not nice to each other, people are not kind to each other. The prayers, they quickly pray just to be able to get out to work. And the town is, not the way it should be." The rabbi didn't respond and didn't give him a coin. He later met his friend outside, and they exchanged what happened with each other, and he said, "What do you mean? That's not fair. I'm also from Kharkov. I also got the same question as you, but I didn't get a coin." So they went back to the rabbi's office and they said, "Why did he get a gold coin and me not?" And the rabbi says, "Believe me, I didn't have to ask you to find out what's happening in Kharkov. I know what's happening in Kharkov. I have people in every single city in Ukraine, and we're doing whatever we can to help the community." The question was, in what way are you part of what's happening in Kharkov? In what way are we contributing to make the place, the environment, the town, the people, the neighborhood, the block that we live in, a place that we can be proud of, a place that brings joy, a place of kindness, a place where God feels comfortable? That, my dear friends, is what we have to ask ourselves as you're about to start on this religious journey. We're all children of God. We all have a purpose. Why we were born, why we were placed on this earth, at this time, to this family, in this community, in this town. And every day we have to ask ourselves, are we living up to that purpose? Are we allowing our soul to shine light on the people around us? Are we bringing God's presence into the mundane physical activities that we're involved in every single day? Are we finding opportunities to uplift ourselves, uplift the people around us, and uplift the world? We all might live in Monroe, we all might live in New Jersey, but the question is, what's happening in Monroe? What's happening in New Jersey? Are we contributing to bring that sense of God, that sense of joy, that sense of positivity to everything that we do? And let us hope, and let us pray, that every one of us takes this message to heart, to find the opportunities that only we have. And every single person has those unique abilities and unique opportunities to make our world a more godly place, a more positive place, and a more peaceful place. Thank you.
Thank you for that most uplifting message, Rabbi. The speakers that we have invited here are so accomplished that to introduce them itself would take me a very long time. So you must excuse me if I am very brief in my introductions, because I want to reserve that amount of time to hear them. It is my pleasure now to invite an old friend of Muslims for Peace, Reverend Bob Moore. Reverend Moore has served since 1981 as full-time executive director of the Princeton, New Jersey-based Coalition for Peace Action, a regional organization dedicated to the global abolition of nuclear weapons, a peace economy, and a halt to weapons trafficking. What an appropriate moment to hear from a man like this. Reverend Moore.
Thanks very much. I am honored to have been invited to speak with your group. I'm a great admirer of Muslims for Peace. You've been doing great work for many years. And it's the kind of positive, proactive peacemaking that I want to say a few words about tonight. I'm so impressed, actually, before I get to that, with the discipline, the spiritual discipline the Muslim community shows. It really, to my mind, even when I try my best to be a good Christian, I fall far short, I think, of the kind of spiritual discipline you show with your fasting for this entire month during the daylight hours. It's laudatory and very impressive, your dedication to God. So, when we talk about peace from a faith perspective, so often I have found over the years that the discussion goes to, well, what do we do if a war is about to break out? It's already broken out, of course, in Ukraine. So how are we supposed to grapple with these matters? And so when I was going through seminary and a lot of my early education in Christianity, a great deal of emphasis was put on what's called the just war theory, the just war doctrine. And essentially, that tried to set criteria under which it was considered to be legitimate from a faith perspective for a person of faith to go to war, to pick up arms, and participate in war. I think that was really the wrong way to approach the issue of peace. It approaches it intrinsically from a negative perspective. What do we do about war? Let's think about war in case that breaks out. And so I'm proud that my denomination, the United Church of Christ, has been at the forefront of trying to create a new paradigm for the Christian community, but I think for the larger faith community as well, in terms of engaging this issue of peace. And we call it just peacemaking. It's about being positive and proactive and creating justice as the basis for lasting peace. Instead of focusing on the negative, we need to be focusing on the positive and on how do we sow the seeds of peace and take the steps actively to create peace even in a situation of war. Now, as the rabbi appropriately said, the war in Ukraine is utterly heartbreaking. The barbarism, the depravity of what is happening there, the war crimes, and that's no exaggeration, it's utter depravity what we are seeing. It is so heartbreaking. But even in that situation, and I have an op-ed that's going to be published tomorrow on NJ.com on how do we de-escalate. So this is one of the ways that we can be proactive, just peacemakers. How do we de-escalate instead of escalate in this kind of horrifying situation? And actually my op-ed is entitled De-escalate now to prevent nuclear war in Ukraine. You all know, of course, that Mr. Putin, the dictator of Russia, and there's no other way of getting around that, he's a brutal dictator, has said that he is putting his nuclear forces on high alert. And actually, intelligence is showing that the command centers where his nuclear weapons are commanded from, there are more personnel that have gone into those command centers. So this is not just an idle threat, it's been repeated over and over. This would make a horrifyingly bad situation far, far worse if it leads to the use of nuclear weapons. And so in my op-ed, I'm trying to tackle the issue of how do we de-escalate. And by the way, I want to say, before I say anything more on this issue, I compliment President Biden for not saying, well, then I'm putting my nuclear forces on high alert. That would be the exact wrong thing to do. So I praise President Biden for showing restraint. But I think we can do more. I think we can actively de-escalate. And one of the ways that we in the U.S. and the West can do that is by taking a positive, proactive step and declaring a policy of the no first use of nuclear weapons. The U.S., France, and Britain are all nuclear powers. You all know that. If all three of those countries, starting, I'd like it to see it start with the United States of America, said, well, we're appalled by you saying you're putting your nuclear forces on high alert, but in response to that, we're not going to put ours on high alert. We're not going to further this escalation. We are determined to de-escalate and declare that under no circumstances will we be the first to aggressively use nuclear weapons. Under no circumstances. Because these are doomsday weapons. They have that name for a reason. They not only could be World War III, they could spell doomsday for the entire planet. We have to prevent nuclear war. Ultimately, my organization, the Coalition for Peace Action, has been working for 40 years to abolish all nuclear weapons everywhere. That's our ultimate goal. And the size of the nuclear arsenals has been reduced over 80% during that time, during the last 40 years. That's headway. We should be heartened by that. We, average citizens, can make a difference. But we need to do more right now. Declaring a policy of the no first use of nuclear weapons could go a long ways toward de-escalating. We could do one more thing to de-escalate the nuclear danger in Ukraine that I point out in my op-ed, and I hope you'll take a look at it. Should be there at nj.com tomorrow. Many of you may not know this, but there are about 100 U.S. nuclear weapons stored in non-nuclear NATO countries, 5 countries altogether. About 100 are at U.S. Air Force bases in those countries. This has been a sore spot for Russia for a long time. You all remember, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what led to that was Russia's feeling that because we had nuclear weapons in Turkey at the time, Thor and Jupiter were their names of those 2 nuclear missile batteries, that they needed to get nuclear weapons to be close to us, too, in Cuba. That was the closest we ever came to having a nuclear war. And I thank God that President Kennedy had the sense to realize that he needed to negotiate. And he negotiated that if Khrushchev would get rid of the nuclear weapons that he had put into Cuba, that the U.S. would take out its nuclear weapons in Turkey. Those were land-based. So the ones I'm talking about that are still in Europe are based on aircraft. Those are a couple of things that we could do that would utterly change the dynamic. When I think about the most important person in my faith, Jesus, he didn't just talk about peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. He was a proactive peacemaker even in situations of oppression. And his people were oppressed, there's no doubt. The Romans were oppressing them. But he said, if you're a slave and you get slapped by your master with the back of his hand, don't go cower in the corner. That's what they expect you to do. Instead, stand right up to that master and say, I am a human being created in the image of God, and you cannot take away my dignity, and turn the other cheek. Now, this is the most misunderstood verse in the entire Christian Bible. Turn the other cheek. It's not about being passive. It's about saying, I can't stop you from hitting me again, from slapping me again. But if you do it, you're not going to do it with the back of your hand. I'm going to turn the cheek to you that you can only hit with your forehand. That means you're recognizing me as your equal. You only do that with the forehand to your equal. So that's just a little taste of the kind of thing that I think we, as people who seek to be instruments of God's peace, can be doing even in situations as grim and as seemingly hopeless as the war in Ukraine. Thank you, and God bless you.